Well, a lot of things that seem to be religious in character are often not purely religious, but cultural, racial, and also involve political interests. So I'm not sure I would see everything through the biblical lens. Don't think that's necessarily a good answer. There is evidence that there could be, or at least there was. And I always point to the outcome of the 73 war, particularly with Egypt. And that produced a treaty and recognition of Israel that was very important. And that was between Sadat and Begin. Those two men came together, and ultimately we got the arrangements that have produced peace on the Egyptian border now for decades. The problem is that that too now is at risk because Mr. Netanyahu has talked about the Philadelphia corridor. This is the border between Gaza and Sinai, which is in Egyptian hands, and said that the Egyptians are not adequately securing it. It's a sieve. In other words, too much is getting into or coming out of Gaza, and therefore we Israelis are going to take it over. Well, if the Israelis decide to do that, that could result in an immediate declaration of war by Egypt against Israel. So I hope that doesn't happen. So there is some evidence that you can forge peace. Now, why hasn't it happened elsewhere? Well, we could spend hours discussing that. But right now, given what has happened in Gaza, I don't think there's much chance of any reconciliation. Now, could there be in the future? Perhaps. But I would tell you that what's happened in Gaza has awakened a new spirit in the region. There's this concept from an ancient Arab, well, I shouldn't say ancient, from the 13th century and 14th century, an Arab historian. And he talked about the concept of Asaviyah. Asaviyah was a discussion point about the cohesion of the Muslim world. Remember, he lived in a world where he could travel from southern Spain all the way to modern day Stalingrad, which was near the capital of the Tartars. And he was entirely in a Muslim environment. Islam stretched across the Middle East, across India, across North Africa, all the way into Spain and back into what today we call southern Russia. And he talked about the fact that people do not understand Islam until they have seen the power of Islam. Now, remember, in the 13th century, Islam was still a very potent force, not just in religious terms, but also militarily and economically.
And scientifically, I mean, they
Yeah, of
conserved all
course.
the ancient writings of Aristotle and all the philosophers, bringing it back to Europe somehow.
Yes, oh, absolutely. And the Jews played a role in that too, within the framework of the Islamic world. Very few people ever talk about that. I mean, the doctor who treated Salah ad-Din and advised him was Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a role for them in that part of the world. That later on there were problems, but the point is that that was a different world.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm not suggesting that today they would all automatically or instantly rise up as one, but people that I know very, very well who are not Americans per se, some are, one or two were, they have traveled within the last 4 weeks to every major capital in the region, including Tehran and Ankara. And they have told me repeatedly that what they hear in Cairo, what they hear in Riyadh, what they hear in Ankara is the same thing. And that is Sykes-Picot is over.
Mm-hmm.
It's finished. In other words, what brought Israel to life is no longer going to be honored any longer. That's very important. And the second thing is that even those who have serious disputes with each other, when I say serious, most of it's territory or people, particularly the Turks and the Iranians, or even disputes over territory in the Arabian Sea between the Iranians and the Arabs and so forth. These things are being suppressed in favor of recognizing the criticality of unifying against Israel and the United States.
Mm-hmm.
It's only a matter of time until we see, I think, the massive embargo on oil and gas begin to take its toll on us, on Israel, and on Europe, I would suspect, over time. The Chinese are very upset about it because they are very dependent on what comes out of the Persian Gulf. They are also dependent on the food that comes out of Africa to reach China and feed a billion people. My point again about Xi is that Xi is the last person that wants a war. But depending upon how these events develop over the next few months, he may feel obligated on behalf of his country to intervene in some way to support those who promise to end this stupidity. And that's not us. And it certainly isn't Israel. Israel wants, in the form, not just because of Mr. Netanyahu, and this is important to point out, Netanyahu may go. This war will not end. What the Israeli population wants is a showdown. And they want us to be part of that showdown because they know otherwise they can't win it. So I think once you begin going after the Houthis, it won't work. And so then someone's going to step up and say, well, we're going to have to send in ground forces. And, my British friends who served in Aden all shake their heads and say, the last thing you want to do is chase these people through the mountains of Yemen. Very unrewarding operation. But I don't see how we avoid that, given the probability that these bombings are not going to change a great deal down in Yemen. I think the Israelis, rightly, by the way, see Hezbollah as far more dangerous and potent than Hamas. And I think they'll want a war of annihilation against Hezbollah, which is why, of course, we had a carrier battle group up there in the Eastern Mediterranean. And I'm sure we'll see another one arrive at some point in the near future to augment and reinforce Israeli operations against Hezbollah. At some point, this brings in Iran. Mm. And the Turks and the Iranians and virtually dozens of countries in the Middle East and Africa, they've all signed on, and so has China, for this court case in the International Court of Justice. Mm. There's no question in anybody's mind about who is responsible for these horrible atrocities and who has to be prosecuted. So again, we're very isolated. We have our, Lilliputian friend in the United Kingdom sailing along behind us in a little dinghy. And then you have the Israelis, who are playing the role of Serbia in 1914, urging the great empire to intervene on their behalf and crush their enemies. It didn't work very well for the Serbs. And this time around, I don't think it'll work well for the Israelis. My greatest concern, and I've always supported Israel, I've always felt that it's a state that should exist for a whole range of reasons. And as a state, it could be a very positive and productive member of the international community. But it may not survive. I think that's a real possibility. Today, no one can conceive of that. But we're in a slow progression down the sort of side of the hill. I always tell people that I see the United States government much like a runaway locomotive. It's headed down the side of a mountain, but it's a mountain in Switzerland, and it takes time to get down that mountain, but they're headed down and they don't have any brakes. Now, there is a brake that's possible. It's called financial ruin. That could operate as a brake on this. But unless that happens between now and April, I think by April, we will be involved in a regional war that sadly has the capacity to become global. I mean, the Russians are not fools. They're watching what we're doing in Sweden and Finland. They listen to these maniacs in Lithuania and Poland. They're worried. I would be if I were a Russian. So they know that we're not suddenly going to have a come to Jesus moment and figure out that there is no threat from Russia and there's no reason for war with Russia. They have to bet on the alternative. Russia will not stand by and allow us to bomb Iran into the Stone Age. They won't permit it. And then there are the Turks. And Erdogan is nothing if not careful, but his population is far more engaged in this and far more enraged than the population in Iran. I would say that at least 50% of the Iranians could care less what happens in the Middle East. That's not true in Turkey. And they will eventually be drawn in. As Erdogan himself has said, the time will come when Turkish soldiers fight in Gaza. I think it's all going to come together this year. And I'm predicting April timeframe, maybe May, but I think it'll take the next several months for this to coalesce and build up. So it is not like 1914, where you could instantaneously trigger de facto existing alliances, because the difference is that the people in the region, their leaders, don't want war, but they will fight. But they'll have to be slowly drawn in the way we are being drawn in, and then it will blow up in our faces. Then the question is, how much larger does it get? Does it become global? Do the Chinese finally step in behind the Russians and decide that they too have to engage? I don't know. But we should not dismiss any of these possibilities. War is something that once you set it in motion, you have very little control over where it goes and what it does, which is why, in most cases, you don't want it. And I always go back to Bismarck. Bismarck always understood that if you're going to have a war, you want to think carefully about ending it as quickly as possible. And you want to end it in a way that everyone can live with the outcome. There's no one thinking about that in Washington at all, and certainly nobody in Western Europe that I can find.
I'm desperately struggling to find the silver lining in this very dark picture at the moment. And this is really an intellectual challenge. But I have to quote Tolstoy in this moment in War and Peace, in this fascinating last book, where he describes the rise and fall of Napoleon. And Tolstoy says, it's not the leaders and it's not the stupidity of the war leaders that are actually influencing the course of politics, but it's the will of the people. And if I take Tolstoy literally, I would say the silver lining, the beam of hope could be that the peoples on this earth, they don't want a huge confrontation. The Europeans don't want war. The Chinese don't want war. The Russians don't want war. I mean, the Americans, they are safe behind two oceans. These wars do not affect them as directly as they do, for example, Europe. Don't you think that the collective will for peace of mankind will somehow, I don't know how, bring a development in motion that finally this whole insanity comes to a stop? Or let's put it even more concrete, isn't there a chance that the Americans would say to the Israelis, now it's enough, stop it? Could at least the Americans stop Israel?
No, I don't see that happening, not at this time. I'd be very surprised if anyone stepped forward with that view. And remember, we talk about the will of the people. It's not the will here, it's the absence of will.
Mm-hmm.
Because again, the population is not engaged.
And it's the dynamics of events.
Yes. And, look, if you go back to the 1930s, go right through 1939 and 40, look at the polling data. No one in the United States wanted another war in Europe. The only way we got a war in Europe was that Hitler foolishly, over the objections of his general staff, declared war on the United States, ostensibly because he was obligated under the treaty with the Japanese. And the general staff said, don't do this. And he said, well, the Americans are already in it anyway. Well, we know that they're supplying our opponents. That's true. But let's not give them an excuse to throw their full weight into the fight. Don't do this. Don't declare war. If anything, you can refuse to do so despite the treaty. And if the Japanese don't like it, that's fine, but they're a long way from us and can't help us or hurt us. Mm. That was good advice. He didn't take it. I don't know what will happen here. But again, as I pointed out, most Americans are not engaged. And you said it very well. We're safe behind our oceans. Americans need to be educated. The oceans now are an illusion. There are Russian submarines right off the coast of the United States who have the capability to destroy most of our cities. We need to wake up and understand that that world we think we are in doesn't exist. And so I think Americans have to be hurt in some way. And I think the most probable way out of this disaster is for things to collapse financially and economically here. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting to me that the biggest supporters for the wars overseas and the interventions are also simultaneously dismissing the problems that we have financially and economically. They're treating the $34 trillion national sovereign debt with complete disinterest. They're ignoring the bond market. They're ignoring everything, frankly. They point, well, look, the stocks are going up again. Great. See, everything's fine. Stock market is not a barometer for the United States and its economy. It never has been. But this is the problem. We're too remote from it. So I think Tolstoy isn't wrong. but he's looking at it in a way that we can't see it today. The Tsar of Russia, Alexander I, was not a very impressive man. He was impulsive, emotional, and childish on numerous occasions, as Metternich points out. But Alexander I actually cared about Russia. Who really cares about the American people?
I mean, do you think that the fact that we have these two wars now in the Middle East and still in the Ukraine, that's a symptom of the weakness of the United States? I sometimes think if we had a stronger presidency in the United States, we would have had more order on this planet. Or is this a too romantic view of Washington?
Well, keep in mind that globalism, which aspires to global governance, is inherently anti-democratic.
Mm-hmm.
Everything the EU wants to impose regarding vaccinations, immigration, rights, whatever, all of it is anti-democratic. The peoples of Europe have not been consulted directly on most of these issues. No one in the United States is being consulted on anything. If you had consulted the American people on immigration, that would have ended 30, 40 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
They were never consulted. If you had asked the American people about what to do in Iraq in 2003 after Afghanistan, I don't think the majority of people would have voted for the invasion. So the problem is the people in power are anti-democratic, and they are convinced that they are making decisions that are good for us. In other words, they have achieved what Marx and Lenin called the monopoly on truth. They know more than we do. We need to be obedient peasants, get in line and march forward under their leadership. I hope the Europeans will wake up first, but the Americans, again, I think the Romans used to refer to this as bread and circuses. We are drunk on bread and circuses. And as long as we are focused on bread and circuses, where the legions are, where war is waged, makes no difference to us. Oh, of course, we have a problem they did not have. Our legions are falling apart because nobody wants to join them. And you have a huge issue there with the quality of people joining them. But no one talks about that because, again, Fantasy Island says it's still 1991 when we were a different nation and we had different forces. It is not 1991. But Fantasy Island hasn't caught up, and I just don't think it'll catch up. Only a tidal wave that comes out of nowhere and sweeps Fantasy Island and rids it of these people can save us.
So that would be, I mean, in my understanding, your appeal, I mean, I take it from your rather gloomy analysis, the appeal is that somehow the peoples, the democratic sovereign, we, the people, we have to topple these governments, find new people, and then they have to work towards peace. Because if we let that just slide on, we are in a situation that gets worse from day to day, and we'll probably end up in a regional or even in a larger than regional big war where you have a real confrontation, a military confrontation between all these powers you have just mentioned.
Yes, I think so. And in a different world, if this were the age of Dwight Eisenhower or Richard Nixon, I think people would say, well, this solution is obvious. Stop the Israelis from bombing Gaza. Pick up the phone calls, stop now, because they would be able to see that it's like looking at an edifice, a wall, an arch, and the stones are falling out. The national security environment is collapsing. So what do? You stop what you're doing because the world doesn't really want to go to war, or it shouldn't, and it's not going to satisfy Israel. But Israel is in a precarious position. It too needs to think about its own survival. It should not overextend itself and overreach and assume that it can leverage us indefinitely. But that is the view right now. And to be frank, there's a lot of evidence that they are right. But as you say, at some point, people will be horrified and shocked. But when is that going to happen? That's why I'm betting on the financial economic dimensions more heavily than I am expecting any sort of rationality to visit fantasy island.
One thing that I think is, in my eyes, a root cause of this mess is the loss of religion. I'm not a very religious man, but I think that the loss of religion, the loss of tradition, the loss of the roots, and the loss also of the humility is a root cause of this, this megalomania that we see in political governments. These people think they are the measure of all things. They think they can succeed, whatever the cost. And there is a total lack of humility. And I think this lack of humility has something to do with the fact that we don't have religion anymore. The people are running after pseudo gods. They think they are gods themselves. Do you think that the lack of religion, the lack of tradition of our roots is somehow one of the deeper causes of all these problems we're talking about?
I certainly think it plays a role. I would go a bit further. And again, Europeans understand this, Americans do not. But if you look at the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, which everybody says was neither holy nor Roman, that
Yeah.
may be true, but that was the largest construct. Then you had Polish Lithuania in the east, then you had France and Britain in the west. But in those times, in the Middle Ages, in the aftermath of the Roman Empire, you had three important institutions that were the foundation of European civilization. One was the church, one was the crown, and the other was the army. World War I tended to destroy those three. World War II almost finished them off completely. Have we ever really replaced those as the foundation for our identity, our purpose in the world? Don't think we have. I mean, whenever I visited Vienna, my friends in Vienna would say, well, welcome to the museum. And I would say, what are you talking about? Well, this whole country is a museum. Who are we? Without what we were, we are what? Are we an extension of the German nation, or are we something else? Nobody's completely sure. The Germans were deprived of all three of those things for all intents and purposes. I don't think the Germans have ever recovered. The French would say something similar. The Poles think so privately as well. And I'm not saying everyone needs to become a fundamentalist and get on his knees or her knees and adopt whatever. That's not the point. The institutional framework is not there. And our institutional framework is breaking down. Our republic was something we regarded as inviolable. And we were very convinced after the Civil War that between the Constitution and, most importantly, the Bill of Rights, that we were in a very good shape. But we always forgot something. The institution is always a measure of the man who controls it and leads it. We've run out of good men, I would argue, for all intents and purposes. And this is something that Lord Macaulay, a British historian, warned us at the time. He said, things will be great in the United States as long as they continue to find good men to run it, to populate it, and as long as the population is engaged. But our problem is now very different. Remember, our structure was designed in the 1780s for a nation of a few million people, all of whom spoke English, most of whom were white and Protestant. Today, what are we? And the other question is, well, today is a very different country. Who are we? And does this 18th century concept of government really make any sense? But I tell people over and over and over again, the thing we must cling to desperately is our Bill of Rights. That is the centerpiece. When that cracks, and we've seen a lot of evidence right now for the weaponization of government against our citizenry, that's falling apart. Now, it hasn't fallen completely apart, but it's at great risk. The Bill of Rights can carry us through many things if we can enforce it. But to enforce it, you have to have the rule of law. And that rule of law, which used to be the hallmark of this country, is definitely in trouble.
Yeah. And this is a phenomenon we see also in Europe. I mean, you see these news that in Poland, the new government taking into prison former ministers. You know, they're arresting them even in the presidential palace. You have, news like this, or you see in Germany where the government institutions start to criminalize the opposition. Everybody who is against the government is called a right-wing extremist, a Nazi, and probably they can be arrested too. I mean, one can argue this is a very dark situation. On the other hand, it can also be read as a symptom of desperation. It shows somehow that these political governments, they're really at the end of their Latin, they are at the end of their song, and the only instrument they have left is to use their power to start to close down the opposition, to fight them. I mean, it's not. It's actually a symptom of weakness.
Oh, I think you're right. I think that's absolutely true. I would compare the current environment as a sort of a slower but nevertheless effective emergence of Bolshevism in the West.
Totalitarian, kind of a soft totalitarian approach.
Yes, yeah, but these people are very much like the Bolsheviks. In this country, we have them who will openly tell you that their inspiration is Trotsky, who, of course, thought of himself as a more humane version of Bolshevism, although he nearly killed millions of people as well. This is what you're talking about, because if you look carefully at the agenda, drop the age of consent for sex with people to 12. I mean, that's being discussed. It's insane, incomprehensible. It's the complete overthrow of what you referred to earlier as any morals at all, in the absence of any notion of Christianity. In fact, Christianity is increasingly treated as the enemy, the source of all evil. And of course, that was the Bolshevik motto. Trotsky ran all over the country in 1919 and 20, destroying not only churches, but synagogues. He destroyed everything in the effort to build this new socialist utopia. We have something similar happening without all of the violence, without the NKVD. But what happened? Ultimately, it all failed. No one wanted it. So you open concentration camps. They called them the Gulag. And then you start putting millions of people in there because your ideology doesn't work. Well, this ideology doesn't work. The good news is that we are not prostrate as Russia was in 1917-18. That's not where we are. There is enough of us left that we can stop this. And I think it can happen in Europe, and I think it can happen here, that we stop it. But the problem is when? How long do you wait?
And what do you
trigger?
And what do you suggest should conservatives do to stop the terror of the left? What do you suggest to conservatives who feel, sidelined, threatened, accused of being right-wing extremists? What's the best way to counter these totalitarian leftist defamations?
Solzhenitsyn once addressed his comments to the Politburo in Russia, and he pointed out at the beginning of them, I know there are sons of Russia in this government who believe in Russia. Where are you? Step forward. And then he went through the rest of his remarks, which were, as you know, very similar to what we're discussing today. I think the question has to be, where are the sons of Germany? Where are the sons of France? We all already see people in the French military, God bless them, who describe themselves as soldiers of France. We will not let this anarchy continue. Well, we need a similar movement, but we need action. In other words, appeal to them as what they really are, not as, Weltbürger, this sort of nonsense. I'm a world citizen. That's all crap. What are you? You're a German, you're Swiss, you're Spanish, you're French. When are you going to step forward and defend what you really are, your country and what it stands for, the institutions that make it up? And that's what I talk about frequently. Where are the Americans? I'm tired of all these people that want to be something else and then American, or want to be a dual citizen or something. That all needs to go away. Either you are an American or you are not. And what is an American? Answer that question. When those questions are answered where you are, I think you will begin to get change, and you will realize these governments in Europe are fundamentally opposed to their own country, their country's history, its culture, its way of life, its people. They want to dissolve it. They want to do away with it. Somehow or another, in their deranged minds, they think this is good for the world. You know, one of the things that we used to say when I was on active duty, we thought we were in Europe because we thought we were defending European civilization. We used to say, if water is purest at its source, then this place called Europe is the fountainhead of our civilization. And that, of course, is when we thought, as Americans, that we too were part of this civilization. Of course, my French friends used to say, Douglas, no one thinks America is really part of Western civilization. And I would laugh. But the point is, that's where you've got to go, you know. And if Europe goes there, we'll be fine. You'll come through it. Because the people that are concerned about their countries, they're overwhelmingly democratic in their orientations. These people are not interested in a messiah to save them. They're interested in countries that work, societies that are effective, that produce things. That's what they want. So I absolutely oppose these people that say, oh, well, you're talking about something that could become fascism. Fascism emerges when countries are fragmented internally, and the majority of the people that are inside the country are at risk. They feel that they could be destroyed. Fascism is about unity. Now, that's why you got fascism in the 30s. It wasn't an accident. And people knew what was going on inside the Soviet Union, and they were afraid of it. Well, there is no Soviet Union. Russia poses no threat. That's not the problem. The problem is at home. The people that are most threatening to the futures of their country are the people that are in their governments. Isn't that awful?
It's awful, but at the same time, what a fantastic end note of this conversation. Your appeal to the sons of Switzerland, the sons of France, the sons of Germany. And I am deeply convinced that exactly this will happen, because I think human beings are constructed in a way to survive. And after terrible errors, somehow the light of enlightenment will touch them. The question is when. Colonel McGregor, many thanks for this, again, so illuminating conversation. It's always a great pleasure talking to you, spanning all these fields and these territories. Thank you very much. All the best. And let's hope for the sons of the United States, of France, and of Germany.
Thank you, Roger.